Human population, agricultural expansion, deforestation, hunting, and the ramifications of economic development have had profound cumulative impacts on the environment, natural habitats, and wildlife populations all over the world. East Africa is no exception. The number of people in Kenya, Tanzania, and Uganda has doubled over the past 20 years and is set to double again in the next 30 to 40 years. Conflicts between people and wildlife currently rank amongst the main threats to conservation in Africa. In Kenya, for instance, with much of the wildlife living outside protected areas, one of the real challenges to conservation is how to enhance and sustain coexistence between people and wild animals. It is undoubtedly evident that the expansion of the human society has forced people to infringe on wildlife habitats and convert land to other uses incompatible with wildlife. An understanding of how the people and conservation agents deal with the problem of wild animals is critical in evolving and establishing sustainable conservation systems. On today's Beef Farming Show, we feature the largest beef farm in Kenya. Richard Van Aert is the livestock and agricultural manager at Ol Pejeta Conservancy in Laikipia County.
Ol Pejeta basically started in about the 1940s. It used to be two separate businesses. One was a wildlife conservation area of about 20,000 acres, and one was about an 80,000, 90,000 acre cattle ranch. Ol Pejeta used to be divided up into paddocks of about 200 to 300 acres each. Each paddock had access to water, and we used to have 14,000 head of cattle and about 20,000 head of sheep here. And wildlife in those days was not tolerated. So if animals, in those days, hunting was legal, so you were allowed to control wildlife populations. And because wildlife was seen as a competition to cattle farming, any wildlife that came in here was shot. Zebras were shot, buffalo was shot, lion was shot. And in the tourist area, cattle were not allowed, because the way of thinking back then was that if you had people paying money to come and see wildlife in Africa on a safari, that if they encountered cattle on their journey, that it would ruin their holiday and they would go back very upset. Yeah? And the same was also true with the livestock farming. They also believed that if you had wildlife with your livestock, you wouldn't be able to run a profitable livestock business. So that was the situation, and Ol Pejeta passed through many different hands, and not many people could make the system work, because the tourism industry was separate. When we went through a downturn in tourism because of election violence or a terrorist attack or something that we normally that happens in Kenya every 5 or 6 years, sometimes more frequently, there would be no other revenue stream to pay the salaries and to keep everyone in their job. And if there was a drought, which also happens normally every 5 years here, there was no revenue stream for the livestock sector. So in 2004, when Ol Pejeta was bought by Fauna and Flora International, who are a big multinational conservation company, they decided to take down all the internal fencing, put one electric fence around the whole conservancy with corridors to let wildlife be able to come in and out, and then to turn this into a conservation area. But after deliberation, it was decided that we should still keep our cattle, but maybe not quite to the numbers that we had before. So we now run a beef herd of 7,500 cattle, and we do not have any sheep anymore.
The best prospects in East Africa for demonstrating the sustainable coexistence of livestock and wildlife are in zones adjoining protected areas, in regions with relatively low rainfall and limited potential for arable farming, where human population density is relatively low, and where livestock owners predominate or are a major component of local communities. Over the last 10 years, Ol Pejeta has proven that livestock integration can not only work but actually be beneficial to the grasslands. Bunched grazing of cattle breaks up the hard-pan soil in times of drought and fertilizes the ground. This allows a rejuvenation of grass in these areas, which attracts herbivores from all over the conservancy. Ol Pejeta's ecological monitoring unit have set up camera traps in these livestock grazed areas and recorded significantly more herbivores in these areas than others. The challenges faced by this integration are the predation from big cats and tick-borne diseases carried by wildlife, particularly the buffalo. Ol Pejeta loses around 1% of its livestock predators each year, but this figure is considered sustainable in such an environment.
So our cattle run integrated with the wildlife. So where our cattle are grazing, we have buffalo grazing, we have zebra grazing, we have lions hunting, we have leopards prowling, we have elephants roaming, all under one ecosystem. And we try and use our cattle as an ecological tool in order to graze areas where our wildlife is not grazing because maybe the bush is thick and maybe they're scared of predators. And we try and use our cattle to create healthy rangelands and to have the grass becoming fresh and new. So when the rains come, we have lots of new fresh grass.
Increased emphasis on poverty reduction and rural livelihoods within donor agencies and some governments, and greater interest in biodiversity conservation justifies examination of apparently competing policies for rural development and wildlife management. Recent developments have escalated the potential for conflict as demographic pressure is both pushing pastoralists to gain access to protected range lands and causing cultivators to farm up to park. Unauthorized hunting or poaching is reducing the attractions of some protected areas. Even where wildlife populations inside conservation areas are well protected, there is a growing recognition that reserves as isolated islands surrounded by wildlife deserts are not suitable.
And as we've developed our system more and more, we're learning more and more ways of how to graze our animals in a better manner in order to increase the amount of grass that we grow. Because ultimately that's what we are, as grass farmers. Yeah. We also keep livestock because the livestock department here brings in about 1/3 of Ol Pejeta's total gross revenue annually. And we also employ about 1/4 of Ol Pejeta's total members of staff are employed by this department. So it's a big economic earner for the Conservancy. It's also a major employer for the Conservancy. And we feel as Kenya's population grows, there is more and more pressure on the available land in this country, especially land which receives adequate rainfall, to produce food for the citizens of this country. And the problem with the old model of conservation, which is very much fence off an area, allow wildlife to remain in it, but no farming activities, is you're not producing food. So you might be making money from tourism or having a very nice environmental system, but you're not producing food for Kenyans. We find this model, we are managing to balance the two between wildlife conservation whilst also producing beef protein for Kenya consumers. All of our beef is sold locally into the local Nairobi market. And we're very proud of the fact that we are able to produce beef while still respecting this ecosystem and enhancing it in a manner that doesn't compromise. We're not cutting down the trees, we're not killing the wildlife, we're letting them grow and behave in a natural manner while integrating our beef system into it. So we've gone from a beef ranch that didn't tolerate wildlife to a wildlife conservancy that tolerates beef cattle. And that really is something very innovative, I think, and something that's really happened here in Kenya. And we have a lot of people, a lot of other conservancies in Kenya who've adopted that same model, in Laikipia especially, and in the Mara. And it's something that people from all around the world are coming to learn about. because there's a growing concern in the world that a lot of the wild spaces and natural areas where wildlife lives is starting to be encroached and starting to be, trees are being cut down, areas are being degraded because of people wanting to use them purely for livestock practices.
For those who may be wondering where this great model of conservancy is happening, the Ol Pejeta Conservancy is a 360 km square wildlife conservancy with the largest beef herd in the country. It is situated in central Kenya, Laikipia County, on the equator west of Nanyuki, between the foothills of the Aberdares and the Mount Kenya. The conservancy is host to the Big Five among a large selection of other African animals, which makes it a popular safari destination. Through the conservancy's community development program, Ol Pejeta provides funding to surrounding communities to aid health, education, water and infrastructure projects. They also support the provision of agriculture and livestock extension services and the development of community-based conservation tourism ventures. We are going to take a short break now. Keep it KTN Farmers TV.